maybe what you have a problem with is like a bad abstraction. It's leaky.
Yeah, just fucking ship it.
The front end should be driving everything in the back end.
I've got a special one for you guys today. Today, Backend Banter goes to war. We are going to war with Frontend First for obvious reasons. The name alone of the Frontend First podcast just cannot stand. But I'm here with Sam Selikoff today. We're actually going to be cross-posting this episode to both feeds. So you'll see this. If you're a listener to Backend Banter, obviously you'll see this episode. And then if you're a listener to Frontend First, you'll see this episode in your feed as well. I'm here with Sam. Sam is I don't want to reduce you to a front-end developer, but it certainly sounds like that's where you're focused at these days. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I wish I would have known you had this podcast when we met in Big Sky, Montana, because we could have just thrown down there and just settled this once and for all, you know?
We could have physically fought, although
yes,
we're both like over 6 feet. So when we hit the ground, it hurts. It hurts.
So true, days. Man. Whenever I play basketball and I fall, people are just always stop and look. They're like, it happens in slow motion because it's just like a tree falling down. But I'm Sam
When you're
Selikoff.
a kid and you're close to the ground, it's like whatever.
Yes,
but when
no
you're
problem.
6 feet tall, it's like, yeah.
The world's not made for us, you know. We have it hard being just tall people. We met in Montana at Big Sky DevConf. I'm Sam Selikoff, and I was giving a talk about kind of back-end frameworks and front-end frameworks, and we had some good conversations there. So yeah, we figured it'd be fun to just get on and talk a little bit about kind of our respective worlds. So that's kind of the idea for this podcast.
Absolutely. One of the most interesting conversations I think we had was actually when it was like me, you, and Prime. You and Prime were a little bit buzzed at the Airbnb. Never had a sip. But no, we were talking to the Airbnb about this idea of kind of what is the responsibility of a front-end framework versus a back-end framework, or as I would actually probably call it, more like a full stack framework like Ruby on Rails. And then the very next day, of course, you gave your talk. By the way, could you just give everyone like a quick, maybe 3 or 4 bullet points on like what your talk at Big Sky DevCon was about?
Yeah, let's get into that in a second. But I actually think this conversation you brought up is a good kicking off, kind of jumping off point, because we were talking about abstractions, and Prime was telling us that lately he has been talking to his audience on stream about the importance of kind of learning the layer below the tools you're using. And it's easy if you stay at the abstraction level you're at to get confused and not understand how things work. And people can be scared to go down a layer. But if you just do that, his argument was kind of like, people should just do that, because once you learn kind of how the sausage is made, then you'll be way more productive. You'll understand when things go wrong. And it's like really important. And I was kind of playing devil's advocate and saying like, that's true, but it's only true to some level. You don't want to keep going down. And maybe what you have a problem with is like a bad abstraction. It's leaky. And if you're using a bad abstraction, then you do find yourself needing to go a level down more often than not. And at that point, it's like, is the abstraction even helping you out? So that's kind of what our conversation was about. And I think it's relevant to what we're talking about today, because a lot of what the front end folks have done in the last 10 years is try to abstract different parts of, building rich UIs on the web. And a lot of times those abstractions are very leaky. And there's a lot of incidental complexity that comes along with them. The classic example of like, we want an SPA to abstract away like DOM APIs and just give us reactive updates in our UI. But now it's like, you have to still think about the API layer, getting the data back and forth. And then you make some sort of API convention that's trying to abstract that away. But the reality is, as anyone who's done this knows, you spend a lot of time getting that abstraction layer, going down a layer and figuring out how to get the data from the back end to the front end. You're doing a lot of wiring at a lower level, whereas the whole point of this paradigm was to be operating at a higher level. So yeah, that's kind of that. I thought that was interesting and kind of relevant to what we're talking about.
to give everyone a little bit of context, I basically just butted into yours and Prime's conversation when we were in Montana, because you guys were talking about this idea of abstraction, and I've heard it both ways. I've heard things like, we just need to ship. We just need to ship. We just need to like build good product, and we need to do it quickly. So we're going to stay at our current level of abstraction, versus like this idea of like kind of going down a level or two deeper so that you can have a better understanding. And my take, disappointingly, is a little bit more nuanced. I'd argue it's in the middle, and it's based on like what your goals are. So this is why Twitter can be so frustrating to me, is like, I kind of am in two different Twitter worlds. I've got like the dev Twitter world, where the people in that world, their goal is to get their first job in tech. They're trying to become great developers so they can have a career as a developer. And who knows, they might go on to like start businesses or do a startup or something, but like their immediate goal is just like, I want to be a great developer. And to those people, I say, I think you should go a level deeper. I think you should take a chance on learning a bit more and becoming just a more well-rounded, more fundamentals first developer. And then there's this other world that I also live in that's like, I'm an indie hacker, I'm starting a startup, I'm an entrepreneur that like, I know a little bit about code. Maybe I got a CS degree, but like, I don't want to go work at Netflix, right? I don't want to go work at another company. Like, I'm starting my thing. And to those people, I'm more on this other side of like, yeah, just fucking ship it, right? Yeah. Like we're trying to build something here. And I know that's a frustrating answer, because it's like, I agree with both of you. But that's kind of the way I look at it. It depends a lot on your goals. And because I work with a lot of people that are, learning and trying to become a career developer, that is why I tend to talk more about this idea of going a level deeper and, down one layer of abstraction.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to talk about my talk a little bit. I have a podcast called Frontend First. I run a website called Build UI. So I consider myself a front end developer because that's where I spend most of my time and attention. But I've been a full stack developer for 10 years. I've done a lot. I started with Symfony, which is PHP web framework. That was my first web framework. And then I did a bunch of Rails. And I kind of found myself getting nudged towards the front end and just loved that part of building. And so I eventually moved to Backbone back in the day, and then Ember is really where I kind of cut my teeth on learning like stateful UI development. And these days I do React. So I like front end development. That's where I like to spend my time, but I still like being able to ship complete apps. So I've spent a lot of time in both communities. And, a lot of this back end versus front end stuff has been going around. And kind of to your point, I think a lot of the reason people were talking past each other online, not only just because Twitter encourages this kind of dialogue, and it is difficult. I think it's easier to understand all of these things when you're talking in person. But there was this debate that's been kind of going around for about a month or two. There's just been some overlap with the JavaScript and the backend communities. And the debate was basically like whether it even makes sense. Like whether, this is one way to frame it, which is like, has all this work that us front end folks have been doing in these front end frameworks, are we reinventing the wheel? Why are we spending time trying to like recreate things that already exist? Should somebody even learn something like React if they want to build like a web application? Because for a web application to work, you have to learn the backend stuff. What does it even mean to call something like Remix or Next a full stack framework when it doesn't have a lot of the things that come out of the box in something like Rails or Laravel? So that was kind of going into my talk, the context. And really all I wanted to do was, Ryan's talk did a good job of like trying to argue and show why what React is doing is not just reinventing the wheel. It's not just like VC funding and us twiddling our thumbs and basically like we like JavaScript, so we're just going to do it again, but like in JavaScript.
Do it this time in JavaScript.
Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely something very interesting to the stuff that's come out in the last few years in React that I think everyone can, like, regardless if you're never going to write JavaScript in your life, there's an interesting idea there. Just like there's an interesting idea with things like live view from the Phoenix community,
For my listeners, like they're going to be very confused about a lot of this stuff because they're very back end focused, right? Building like JSON APIs in Go and stuff like that. So, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding of this, let's specifically talk about your talk, is you've got frameworks like Laravel and Rails, and they're what we are calling full stack frameworks. And by default, out of the box, a front end developer might call them a backend framework because the rendering, again, by default at least, happens on the server. So like Rails, Laravel, they're generating HTML, CSS, JavaScript server side and then shipping it to the client. And so you get these full round trips whenever you like navigate pages or take actions. And then in the JavaScript community for the last, 10 years or so, JavaScript developers on the front end have been building single page applications, which is like everything happens client side, right? So like we're just shipping a bunch of JavaScript to the client, to the web browser, and it's going to make API calls to a backend and kind of dynamically do everything on the front end. And now that the JavaScript community, I should say, is interested in server-side rendering for a bunch of reasons, performance, SEO, whatever. That's what Next and Remix are kind of doing, and Nuxt. The argument is basically like, well, whoop-de-fucking-do. Like Ruby on Rails, Laravel, they've been doing this for like 15, 20 years, whatever, however long they've been along, I'm not actually sure. But like, this is nothing new. So what I'm understanding from like your talk, and then of course from Ryan Florence's talk, is like, okay, no, there actually is something different here with what JavaScript's doing. What's the different thing?
So we could talk about that. I'm trying to think. There's like a lot I have reacting to what you just said. So the first thing I want to say is React has had server-side rendering, and this is a little confusing, but React has had server-side rendering for like 8 years. When Next first came out, which was like in 2015, that was one of the big benefits. That was probably the main reason people started using Next to begin with, is because it was an easy setup for server-side rendering. It's more like, you could think of it, you can pre-render something if you're still going to ship that SPA and you're not going to have a server processing requests at request time, but you could pre-render content. But you could also set up a server that did the same thing that Rails or Laravel does. And it returns HTML at the time of the request, but then it also, kicks in on the client after the first render so that subsequent navigations are happening on the client. And that gives you some benefits, like it's more snappy, like you can render things faster or whatever. So server-side rendering is something that has been around. The thing that's new in the last year or two is server components, which are different than server-side rendering. So we can talk about those in just one second. I think the next thing I want to say is, yes, it's true that Rails and Laravel have had, the ability to generate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and respond with that. But, I was listening to Rails World from last year podcast, because they just had like a 20th anniversary or something of Rails. And it was a really cool conference. And I watched a lot of the talks. I mean, DHH is like one of my main programming kind of, mentors, I guess. I learned a lot from him. And a lot of, I learned a ton from him. And so I still follow his work and I follow the Rails work, even though I'm not using it as much these days. And in this podcast, it was interesting because there was, folks who were kind of diehard Rails fans. They've been using Rails for 15 years. And they were like talking about stimulus and turbo and the different things that Backend First frameworks, let's call them, have added to like add more interactivity on the front end. And they say the amount of backflips I still do to get React in my Rails app, just so I can install like a drop down or a modal, right, is crazy, but they still do it. So that's the first point I would make to the kind of perspective that like, we've already been able to do this, haven't we already do this? I think there is something unique about React, or, pick your favorite front end library, that has cracked this code of like composable, shareable UI bits. There's a model there that has led to an ecosystem that makes backend developers, quote unquote, do backflips to get React into their Rails app, right? And yes, you have folks like DHH who don't really like that because they don't like the complexity to get there. But there's something, I think, undeniable that even someone who has never done a front end framework like a Next or a Remix knows that you get when you bring these kind of front end tools and libraries into your app. So that's kind of setting the stage, and I think that's just that alone is enough to say it's something. There's something different here. There's a reason why those libraries in React are higher quality, work better, easier to customize. You don't get locked into something like, maybe Bootstrap back in the day where it's really hard to change and customize. People pick and pull all these different components and hooks from React, and it makes them, raise the ceiling of their UI, which is kind of what my talk was about. So that's kind of the first part, and then we can go into the thing that was really Ryan's point, which is kind of like what is different about the server components. But that's the first thing that I would say is just like, that's kind of how I think about it,
So just to repeat that back to you to make sure I understand. So the idea is that, yes, Ruby and Rails, Laravel, Django, pick your like, tenured kind of backend first full stack framework.
Mm-hmm.
They've been shipping a lot of stuff that's, like, in your words, backend first, right? Like, they've got an ORM out of the box. You can interact with your database. They've got things for like background jobs and workers. But the experience on the client, once stuff gets there, is subpar. And that's why people are shoving React into their full stack apps.
Exactly. And then there's different ways that people cross that boundary, but that's exactly what my talk was about. So my talk was called High Floor, High Ceiling. And the argument was these mature backend first frameworks have a high floor and a low ceiling. The high floor is because their battery's included. And if you look at the Laravel docs on how to write a test for a background job or a cron job that sends an email, you're using all first-party Laravel components, and nothing like that exists in the front end. So if you start with a Rails or Laravel, you're starting on the 10th floor building your app. You don't have to pick and pull all these components together. But the ceiling out of the box is going to be limited to what HTML does or what JavaScript can do, or, things like HTMX, or you add Livewire, or all these other frameworks that are meant to work in a backend first environment. Those raise the ceiling. That's kind of what those backend frameworks have been trying to do. Turbo as well, Turbo is like a way for a Rails app to do drag and drop without having to like leave kind of the Rails world and go into React. So that's like the high floor, low ceiling. And then those of us, I kind of didn't tell the story, but in the beginning of my talk, I say like, how did I go from Laravel and Rails to like, Backbone and Ember? Well, I was working on this dashboard and I had this like D3 chart, and I wanted to hover a slice of the pie and animate all the visualizations. And like, I was in PHP. PHP doesn't have anything for that. So I started looking at Ember and stuff like that, tools that were made for this, for UI. And that's kind of where I got, because I wanted a higher ceiling. I hit the ceiling of what I could do out of the box with something like Symfony, and I wanted that higher ceiling. But those of us who are using like front end first frameworks, we have that high ceiling because we're kind of living in the browser, in the client. But the back end, the floor dropped out from underneath us. And, that's now what we're working on adding things to. So Remix and Next and all of these things that can raise the floor. And we both want the same thing. We all want a high floor to start out building an app on the 10th floor, and a high ceiling so that if it's good for our product to add drag and drop, we can do it easily. We don't have to, make a big architectural change to get data into the client to enable these rich interactions.
So do you want, I know you're not like I'm pretty sure you're not a framework author, right?
No.
You're a user of Next and Remix and stuff. So is what you want for these, let's say, front-end first full stack frameworks like Next, like Nuxt, where the experience has mostly been on making really great client interactions with like server-side rendering, but there's been less of a back-end focus, less of a background jobs, less of a database, ORM experience. Do you want them to push more features and more out-of-the-box stuff for that kind of back-end work? Again, ORMs, background jobs, that kind of stuff?
Yes. The goal of my talk was not to say like everyone should be using React now that we have server components, or everyone should be using Rails now that it has Turbo, or anything, because all these frameworks, people use tools for lots of reasons, and they're all going to keep pushing on the boundaries of their current tools, their current stack. The back-end frameworks are going to keep trying to raise the ceiling. The front-end people are going to raise the floor. So I was trying in my talk to highlight what I think the strengths of both communities are and what they could learn from each other. So yes, I think the front-end community can learn about cohesion from the back-end community, because a lot of folks who have been doing front-end stuff have never seen what it's like to create a model in Active Record in a Rails app, be able to send an email and then just do it after the request. You respond with a request because you have a background job system built in, to be able to write a full stack test that tests the database, to be able to set up a cron job. All of the stuff that is, there's a cohesion, and there's a certain level of expressiveness in the APIs that you only get if the backend framework author kind of puts a stake in the ground and says, if you're making a Rails app, here's how you model your data. Like, you're going to use a relational database. You're going to have foreign keys, and the name is going to be, user underscore ID lowercase. Like, you have to just make a decision about that. And what that enables is this rich, cohesive APIs for all the different parts. And the status quo in front end land is just not that. People pull together services, and there's a lot of bugs and time spent wiring them up because your CMS or database provider doesn't know about your background job, how you write tests for all that stuff. So I think the front end community can learn about this cohesion from the back end communities. And I would like to see front end frameworks become more opinionated. When DHH started Rails, like, web frameworks weren't really a thing. And people think like, oh, it's just the difference between back end and front end. If you look at DHH's early talks, he was on like a crusade for multiple years just to convince database administrators, like, what you name your foreign key columns doesn't matter. He was like, we're not snowflakes. We all like to think we are, but this is like the convention over configuration thing. And this is like the definition of bike shedding. You're arguing about what color to paint the bike shed, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Yeah. So he had to argue that, for a long time. And he was like, Rails is omakase. It's like my decision. And, I'm going to listen to people, but like, if you don't want to do it, it's not for you. But that let that floor raise so high. Whereas again, in front end land right now, the framework authors are just kind of like, oh, you can use Cloudflare, you can use this, you can put it on Mongo, you can put it here, you can use this service, you can use Clerk for auth, you can use Auth0. So when you have that maximum flexibility, that's kind of the price you pay.
Okay, I got to jump in here, because to a lot of people listening to this, they might think, especially from the Frontend First podcast community, Lane's a backend developer. Like, he's on the side of Rails and Django. Famously, I am not. I'm a huge fan of DHH as well. I've read 37 Signals, the like famous, I guess you could call it a blog post. It's more like an interactive website at this point, but great stuff. And DHH has been around for a long time, and he's incredible. The problem that I have had with Rails and Django over the years is that I've worked at companies that have processed pretty big amounts of data, at least by like Rails standards. And it's not that like there certainly is a component of like, we were using Rails wrong. So I want to like put that out there as a caveat, but it does encourage you to do some things and go down some paths that can be hard at scale. For example, we ended up with this really weird thing where we had a full Rails app in like this distributed, microservices system that was just doing background jobs. And it was so weird because it was like, I could write this thing in Go, and it's 15 lines of code. But no, I have to like do all of this stuff and ship Ruby to the server and set up Docker, like all this extra stuff just to get this background job running, and just so it can go literally 50 times slower than it would be if it was just a tiny little Go app written in, again, like 20 or 30 lines. So this brings me to my point, which is, I get this idea of like a full stack. Let's just assume JavaScript for a minute. A full stack JavaScript framework that has, amazing client side interactions, has SSR, has an ORM. Let's just assume we get to this place where it has all these features. My concern is exactly what you said, like that to get there, you have to have really strong opinions about a lot of things. And the funny thing is, I actually am very much on the like in the camp of I love strong opinions in the technology I use. Like I'm a Go developer. I love the fact that it ships with a standard formatter. Like, right. I don't use too many configurations in my editor. I try to keep the defaults for simplicity's sake. But I like those opinions at what I would call a library level.
Yeah.
Rather than a framework level, such that I can like compose the libraries that I need. And they're all independent. They're all like independent and opinionated in their own right. But like, it's like my app is a snowflake, but my individual use cases aren't. And so it's almost like I just want to push those opinions down a level. Does that make any sense?
It does make sense. And it kind of goes to the other half of my talk, which was, so if I think it's really a pendulum that we're talking about, there is a trade-off between something like cohesion and something like flexibility, right? There's a tension there. If you make something more cohesive, you restrict its public interface, it's less flexible, but it's easier to use. And it's easier to use if you don't, for you not to have to understand everything that's going on, which is a great thing a lot of times, especially like when I was starting out. I could build so much with Rails without really understanding all the pieces. And, DHH talks about this a lot too. He talks about conceptual compression, and that's kind of his goal with Rails. So I think the front end folks can learn from that. But the other half of my talk is basically exactly what you said, which is what can the back end folks learn from the success of libraries in the front end like React? And it was basically this idea of composition. I think composition has been a core value of React since the beginning. And I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say React has had like the most influence among the front end frameworks. And that composition is what has enabled this ecosystem of components that are so good, so easy to use, so powerful that even a Rails developer of 15 or 20 years is going to do backflips to get them into their server-side app, right? So I think if that's kind of what the second part of my talk was about. If you look at kind of the no spooky action at a distance, kind of the locality of behavior, even like the lexical scope, that was kind of a more nuanced point. But really this idea of composition, that is something that's really powerful. It enables scalability, swapping out parts when you need it. And yes, there's been plenty of people who have hit the ceiling of like performance and scalability in something like a Rails app. And I think that there's no reason something like Rails could embrace some of those patterns, still provide you a cohesive experience out of the box, but use this idea of like, instead of like, just as a concrete example, like I'm working on a Rails app right now, actually in a consulting project, and the whole file-based approach with auto loading, that was like a solution to a problem a long time ago. But being able to just open a page in a Next app and see everything that page depends on by following the import graph, I think that is something that even backend developers love about working in React. That is all in one file. You can add a second class or module or function in a file. You don't have to break it up until you need to. It's not the same in traditional backend frameworks like Rails. So that's more of like a code maintainability thing in terms of scalability as opposed to performance. But I think the idea is the same. So anyways, to just answer your point, I think there's tension here between cohesion and composition or flexibility. And you definitely have to use the right tool for the job. Maybe DHH would argue you shouldn't make a Rails app to have it run a background job. Like a Rails app is for like a web application that like a user using in a browser.
That one's on us. That one's on
You're
us.
Right. So that's an argument. But in either case, I think that's kind of, I think there's room for both. And it's ultimately, it's not a back. It's not a back and forth with no progress. I think we're all getting better at bending that curve,
Yeah, it was definitely, just to give a little bit of history, like it was definitely when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail sort of situation. Like we had a bunch of only Ruby devs. And so it was like, how do we do code? We do code with Rails.
Rails new,
and we're going to go look up like every possible way to do this in Rails. It's like where you've got the auto prefix on your Google search, like in Ruby on Rails, how to do X thing, right? So yeah, that was definitely on us. I think like Bootstrap versus Tailwind is like a good example of this idea that's in my head, which is like, it would be a shame, I think, if like a big meta framework like Next was like, we're shipping Bootstrap, right? And you just get Bootstrap.
Right.
It has opinions about about what your UI will look like, rather than just how you build your UI. Whereas like I think why Tailwind has gotten so much traction, and like we use Tailwind at boot dev, even though you look at it and there's no way looking at boot dev that you'd be like, oh, this uses Tailwind, because it's just
a great
so
example.
You can like
style
whatever you want with Tailwind. It just has opinions about like how you're gonna do it.
Right.
And I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big fan of like grabbing composable bits that have tons of opinions and using them the right way, right? Again, we use Go, we use its auto format, we use its like built-in formatter. Let me pitch you this idea of interfaces. So my take is that I would like my frameworks and my libraries and my languages to ship more standardized interfaces and less and care a little bit less about the implementations. I believe this is how Rails does like mailers, if I understood our conversation in Montana correctly. Because like they'll ship an interface, like this is what you need to send an email. It's like you need to provide a subject and a to email and a body and whatever. But like that implementation can be Amazon SES, it can be SendGrid.
Yes.
And like that to me is very valuable.
Yes, it is very valuable because again, if you listen to like the zeitgeist on Twitter and you create a new Next app and you ask, how do I send an email? You get, you can use anything. And there's services that make it easy. And how do you do auth? Sure, you can drop in like a clerk and it's going to give you a nice component. But like it's the stuff between the components. It's all of the pieces in between that where the hidden complexity lies, right? And even with things like latency, where you have service A over here and B over here, and there's no one thinking about using this service with that service, right? And there's a lot of complexity there. So I think Rails, probably compared to when you used it last, has gotten a lot better at this. And then definitely frameworks like Laravel, where they have something like what you're saying, an action mailer, and it has like a connect and a send and all these interfaces. And no one sends emails from their own Rails server, because sending emails today, it would be like, it's possible, but it's most people would use whatever, Google, AWS, ConvertKit, and there's adapters. It's like an adapter pattern, but you can still test the things. And in test mode, you use like the test mailer, and it opens up your HTML email in the browser, and you can see it and you can assert against it. Again, this is done for everyone. So every Rails app that sends emails has tests that look the same, regardless if you're using SES to send your actual emails in production.
Yeah.
And this is true at like every layer. And there's a lot of layers, and Active Record is the same way. It's an ORM, but you can swap it out with different databases, but the interface is the same. And so if I can do user find one and get a user object, I don't know if I'm going to Postgres or MySQL or even like Mongo, but my job and my mailer and my UI all know how to find a user for an ID. And it's just, it.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to approach this.
So that's the one where, to me at least, and this is mostly a personal preference thing, that one's just up like one level too high for me. So in Go, for example, the standard library ships, there's a database SQL package, and it ships a standard interface for a SQL database. It's pretty low level. It basically just handles like connection pooling and like escaping of variables. There's like a couple like pretty low level things, but it assumes like SQL is the interface. So like you're sending, SQL strings essentially, or you're building SQL strings. And like every ORM in Go that's relatively popular, I guess technically the one I use actually isn't an ORM. It's more like a query builder, or the inverse of a query builder.
Yeah.
We actually write the query in SQL and then it compiles to like Go bindings.
Interesting.
But like I like that. Again, this is just I would just push that one down one level.
And that's really like that's like an interface preference. But I think that the higher level point here is like, how can you write a test that, seeds your data layer with some data, and someone signs up and you verify that that user was created, and then an email was sent that says hi, their first name. I think that's like a good example of like the kind of thing that you should be able to do when you're building an app, and the kind of thing that frameworks like Laravel and Rails have thought a lot about, and the kind of thing that just gets brushed aside or swept under the rug when you're piecing together your own pieces, because it's hard to get all of those pieces working like that. And testing is just one benefit, regardless of how you feel about testing. I just think that you should be able to do that kind of thing. And that's an example of the things that it enables.
Yeah, and I should be fair here in the sense that, like, I just mixed a language and a framework, right? I was talking about Go standard library. And to be fair, very few Go developers use a like framework or meta framework like Django or Rails. But like, it is to be expected that Rails or Laravel is going to have more opinions than a language, right? Because it'd be more like comparing Go to Ruby, which in that case, Go has way more opinions than Ruby has about how you should ship apps.
But it's still relevant because it's kind of like if you're a Go developer and you need to access data, how are you going to do it? And so that's kind of what you're saying. I think Elixir and Phoenix is another good one. I think Jose Valim, he came from the Rails community and he made Phoenix, which is a framework for Elixir. And I think their data layer is more like structs. It's less like rich objects, it's not like the active model pattern. But again, that's more of like a preference kind of, and there's some pros and cons to that, but it's more about thinking about how all the pieces work together. So yeah, I think that's that cohesion bit. That was what I was trying to communicate in the talk about cohesion and how it's worth addressing and worth thinking about, because we in the front end community, we love to talk about composition and flexibility and picking your own pieces, but we don't acknowledge that there is a cost. There is a cost to flexibility, and that cost is that it's harder to use, and you lose some cohesion, and there's things you don't think about. There's more bugs that are introduced. So that was really the idea there.
You have to make choices, and sometimes you make bad choices.
Yes, exactly. Something else you made me think, why is my podcast called Frontend First? Actually, there's kind of a story here. Well, we used to be called like the Ember Map podcast because we were teaching Ember. But when we thought about what was really important to us, and this kind of goes along with my journey, I guess, from like focusing more on the front end, even though I started in the back end, is that Frontend First is less about, it's not about being a front end developer. Frontend First, the idea there is that when you're building anything, the motivation, the motivation for what you're building should be derived from a feature, a user value, a product benefit.
Yeah.
And this was one thing that I actually really loved when I moved to front-end frameworks, because like you said, they didn't ship with a bootstrap or anything that was opinionated. You're really starting from, okay, what does the product need to do? And I'm going to build a front end and try it out, and then everything that goes back is kind of going to derive from the front end feature I'm building. Whereas at least back in the day, if you started a Rails app and you were making like a blog, you might scaffold a blog resource, and it's going to give you like blog index URL and a blog new URL and a blog ID edit URL. That's already like putting opinions into your UI, which may or may not be good for your app or your users. But as UIs got more rich on the web, it's like, I don't want my database modeling shouldn't be leaking into my front end. Like the front end should be driving everything in the back end. And of course, I'm going to use like good database modeling techniques to make sure my data is normalized and fast and everything. But at the end of the day, the way the UI looks shouldn't be driven by the database model. It should be driven by the feature and the benefit. And if I want to make a new post and have it show up in a modal, because when you create a new contact on your phone, that's like the nice way that's like what is best for the user. That should be independent of the back end technology. So that's another aspect of the front end first thing.
That's a really good point. I really liked that bit. Sometimes I say that like your types should flow from the database to the front end. But I think this is such an important caveat. That doesn't mean that your product decisions should.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
it's because like it is so nice. This is why like, you know, TypeScript's really popular right now. And like a frustrating thing for our app is that we've got Go on the back end, TypeScript on the front end. So if we want like our types to flow, we have to do a conversion step, like from our Go types to our TypeScript types, so that everything can come down to the front end. And like we trust that a field is going to exist in the type that we expect in the browser, all the way back to like our data model in the database. But there's an interface there. And we make decisions all the time, like fairly manual decisions to like, okay, this endpoint, like, yeah, it accesses like 4 different data models, but the data it returns is going to be like some custom mashup of that data, right? It's going to be like these 3 fields from this one, these 4 fields from this one. And it's just because this is a very product driven endpoint that does a very specific thing. And it's not like, I don't know, it's the opposite of this would be like a very opinionated, like restful, and I do scare quotes there on purpose, like restful API where just everything is exactly one CRUD operation on one resource. And that feels nice as a developer. It feels clean, but like you said, sometimes it makes building a product driven UI hard and subpar and more difficult than it needs to be.
Yes, those two should be absolutely separate, 100%. And I actually think it's just like, you can think about it like, you know, null constraints on a database. There is business logic that affects whether a field has null constraint or not, is nullable, right? That's something that you want to do at the database level to prevent like impossible states from existing in your app. But how you show it in the UI is just very different. But I find a lot of times these technical decisions do bleed into product decisions. And so I think that Rails, for example, encouraging like different URLs for every operation, that's already way too much for me. I don't want to be told anything about, you know, if I'm going to delete a to-do, that I have to go to the edit page first. I just want to clear it on the home screen, right? And I want tools that enable me to do that. I actually think that GraphQL is a good way to think about this, even if you never used it or regardless of what you think about it. The fact is that GraphQL fully embraced this kind of front-end first thinking and mindset because it was designed to let the front end query exactly what it needed from the back end for the purpose of a page or a screen or an interaction. And there were some really cool libraries. Actually, Ken Wheeler worked on one called Urkel, and it could pull data from different GraphQL endpoints. So to your example, like you're making 4 different tables and you're aggregating them. And but it carried type information. So that's an example where the front end is determining the query. It's saying, I need, you know, the tweets with just the body and the like count, but I don't need anything else. And I also want like the followers of these people. So I'm going to do a join. All the type information is going to flow from the back end to the front end, let's say. But it's not what's the word I'm looking for? It's not like nudging you to build a certain UI, you know, just because the types are coming from that. It's GraphQL is being driven by the product, by the front end, by the user flow that you're building. So I think all tools should do that regardless. But I really think that the front end frameworks have nailed this. And the flexibility of the UI, of creating new pages and components, of being able to add, you know, different functions and handlers and endpoints kind of wherever you need them, does help give you more of a blank canvas and is more product focused. It's more like grounded in the product. And I think that's something that they've done well as well.
Just especially for some of my listeners that might not be familiar with GraphQL, at least as it pertains to this discussion, one of the interesting things about GraphQL is that you as a front-end developer, you're not like going and looking up docs for an API and like seeing what's available to you. It's a much more flexible paradigm where, in fact, the API out of the box is self-documenting, so you can like make queries against it to see what's available to you. And in your queries, you tell the API what you want, kind of like you do with SQL, right? Like you specify the fields that you want returned back to you. And I think I'm not going to say there's no use cases for it. The big challenge I ran into with it was that it does open you up to all this flexibility, but it also pushes, I would argue in some ways it's a leaky abstraction in the sense that it pushes a lot of performance stuff down to like front end decisions, in the sense that like you try to do a big aggregation of grabbing a bunch of stuff, and it's not necessarily obvious to you as a front-end developer that that's going to do like a crazy amount of joins on the back end, maybe even hit different
N+1 or something like
microservices,
that.
and then
Yep.
like N+1 as well. Like, and it's like, why is this taking 12 seconds to return?
Totally.
And so then you have to like jump into the back end anyway and start to debug performance. But this idea of like giving front end developers a more flexible way of accessing data from the back end, I think is at least the right flow to think about.
I agree with you. And it's always going to be the case that the actual tech you're using in the back end will influence like the front end code a little bit, obviously, like even if you're using REST or whatever. But yes, GraphQL can leak a little bit in the sense that you have to know, in the same way that, like you said, SQL can leak. I mean, you could write crazy SQL queries and someone who knows SQL would just be able to say, no, you should do a join. You shouldn't do selects in a loop. You should add an index. So yes, there's times where you have to dive down a layer. But the idea is I think the right one. I don't know how much time you have left, but we can talk about server components a little bit if we want to wrap up with that.
Yeah, let's do it. I just had one more thing to say on that, which was that about GraphQL, just because it's a funny experience I had. When you interact with a RESTful-ish API, like for example Stripe, you usually have a rate limit. Like you can only make so many requests. And that's generally really easy to reason about as the client. You can be like, okay, I'll only make 10 requests per second. You put some rate limiter on it, whatever. When I was interacting with the Facebook Graph API, which is backed by GraphQL, they build you based on CPU on their servers. And so you had to like read the headers and be like, oh, that API request I just made used like, however much CPU time, and I only have this much time left. And so again, like it's just pushing this idea back on the client of like, you can do whatever you want. You can join all those users and all those posts together and get back that data, but like might take 5 seconds and it might really limit like how many requests you're able to make.
Very interesting. I never knew that, but that makes sense because because you can aggregate a bunch of queries into one. Like GraphQL supports like putting a ton of stuff in a single query. If that's what you need, then they're like, well, people are going to send us expensive queries, so yeah, we need to look at how expensive it is and charge them based on that.
Exactly. Okay, cool. Let's hop into the RSC stuff.
Yeah. So this really is just like I would say for your listeners, even if you're not at all care about what's happening in React land, there is an idea here, just like with the GraphQL discussion, that is worth looking at, because I think this idea will like infect other communities, and it's a really interesting idea. So if you like what I'm about to say, I would encourage you to watch Ryan's talk, Mind the Gap, from the conference, because he does a really good job explaining it. But basically, so we kind of talked at the beginning how like server-side rendering of HTML has been in React for a while. And server components, which are, it's kind of hard. The naming is tough, but server components are something different. They are a new feature coming to React 19. And ultimately what they're trying to solve is similar to the GraphQL thing. They actually came out of Relay. Relay was this idea of using GraphQL co-located within your React components. And then there was this build time step that would say, the notifications count needed the notifications for the current user. And this messages component needed, the latest 5 messages and the people and the authors of those things. We could take those static queries and put them together and make the request on your behalf. That's how Relay works, which is a library that, Facebook uses, but never really gained widespread adoption.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, if you just step back, whether you're the Rails guy who's bringing in a dropdown, right, or to a Rails app, or you're a React guy and you're bringing in a database through some node server, like the hard thing is like moving the data back and forth, because when you add rich UI stuff, you're adding state on the client. So you have stateful UI. You have a dropdown that opens and closes. You have a table that you can sort, but the table's data comes from a database, right? And you can resort it using the URL so that you keep the sorting logic on the server. But a lot of people, again, do backflips to bring in React because they want a fast sort or they want something instant. All sorts of UI interactions that they want to be instant happen on the client. So this like idea of like shuffling state back and forth and data back and forth is really where so much of the complexity lives today, regardless of which stack you're using. And this is really the problem that server components were designed to solve. Server components run on the server, but they only run on the server. So this is different from the server-side rendering, where we would pre-render HTML, but then once your app kicks in, it kind of takes over on the client, and we start doing like client navigation and client rendering. This is more like a Rails controller. Like it only runs on the server ever.
Oh,
And it
really? It
returns
never runs
data.
again on the client.
It never runs again on the client.
Okay.
And what's fascinating about this is that exactly the reason you would use something like a Rails controller, which can coordinate, takes in a request, it can access data from the data layer, and it can return a response. And it is in a secure server. It's in your server. So it has direct access to the database. It has all of your API secrets in the environment because it lives and only ever runs on the server. That's what a server component is. But it's that packaged in the same component interface that a React component is. So it's literally like an HTML tag. It's angle bracket invocation, name of component, and then prop passing. But conceptually, you're running like a controller in a Rails app.
Right. So like it feels the same as a developer.
It feels like playing with Legos
like
because
app.
like, yes, it feels like just dropping in a component, which is really easy to think about. And this is where it gets interesting. It composes in the same way that React components compose. So it's pretty fascinating. So you say, why would I want, if I'm rendering a users table, and in Rails, I would make a request to like /users table, and the controller gets the request. It fetches the latest 100 users from the database, and then it returns HTML with the table and all the response. You can think about that as rendering a users table, right? So why would I want to render a users table as a component instead? Well, components compose. And it turns out that you can compose server and client components together. So I can actually put a modal component that's a good old client-side React component that opens up a modal and it uses animation, and it is running in the client. But inside of it, as its children, I can drop a users table. And that users table is doing the same thing in the first pass, and it outputs an HTML table of users, and only the result gets sent to the front end, but it gets slotted in the modal. And so it's kind of this new,
is it like hiding in the JavaScript somewhere, or hiding in like a shadow DOM or something?
So it gets there's a serialization format called an RSC payload, and it is effectively a serialized version of like that HTML that table generated.
Okay. So it's sitting in like JavaScript memory, serialized, waiting to be rendered.
The client can request it if it does a render pass. Right. So let's say I navigate. Okay. Let's say I navigate and then I render a modal. And the modal is like normal client-side JavaScript that's been loaded on the browser and is running in the client-side, JavaScript thread. And it animates up the modal. But its children ran before. So yes, it could be like hidden in, let's just say that the payload is like, I guess this would be.
So it's like already fetched, but it's like sitting in memory somewhere.
Exactly. Okay. Right now it works on like a per route basis. So yes, it's just like
it's like prefetched and
page.
Then sitting
yes,
there.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's interesting because it's just the result of rendering the table, which means that now this users table, it looks way cleaner than these frameworks did before, because the actual server component is like an async function, and you can await database.fetch, and then you can like return a table, and you don't have to like use effects. It's not re-rendering ever. It's just the good old request response cycle, and it looks and feels like any server request handler from any server-side framework, but it composes with the rest of your React tree. And Ryan's talk is basically about this, and how what's cool about this is that it really is a new way to think about getting rid of the network, in the sense that I could just return that server tree or that user table, which is a server component, and it renders like inert HTML, right?
Yeah.
But let's say I have those users and it was a prop that I fetched from the database. I can actually swap the users table with like a sortable users table and just pass the prop and have that table render it. But because that table has the use client directive, right? And it has React state and it lets you toggle it, all of a sudden, like that data in that RSC format is getting passed, but it feels like passing props and it feels like
Right.
working on one app. That's kind of the goal of this, right? And if you think about it, it's the goal of all of these abstractions. Like you want to feel like you're building one app. And just because I have to, make the text switch, like HTMX is a great example of that. It doesn't feel like I'm building like a client app and a server app. It's just like one app. But this is really kind of taking it to the next level, and it really embraces the power of composition in React. So, yeah, pretty fascinating stuff.
I need to dig a little bit more into RSC. So we use Nuxt as like our backend for front end at Boot Dev, which I'm like brand new to. I've done a bunch of Vue in the past, but this is like my first time using a meta framework. And it has a bunch of ways to do, server-side rendering and like, or do it on the client. But I know it's fairly different than what RSCs are doing. So I need to give it another look. And by the way, for everyone listening, when we keep saying Ryan, we're talking about Ryan Florence.
Yes.
He's the remix guy
Yeah.
who I have not yet had on the pod. So if you know him, bother him and tell him.
I'm sure he'd love to come on. I'm sure he'd love to come on the pod. Ryan's not only the author of Remix, he's one of the most important people in the React community and the front-end community for the last 10 years. I mean, a lot of his work, his open source work has influenced a lot of the APIs that came to React. He had this thing that was like component, which was like a pretty big, a lot of it was inspiration for even things like hooks. It influenced the design of a lot of the things that came to React because he was solving these problems for himself. And, anyways, Remix is his framework, and it added a lot of features around things like forms and action handling, which React now has, and React has pulled from a lot of influences. But I think Remix did a great job, like showing an actual proof of concept, like working version of all of this in a React app. And, part of the reason I'm so excited about server components is that I think we will be able to get more cohesion in our front end frameworks, because now something like a database could ship a component that lets you like have that declarative query, but it's part of the component and it composes, and you don't have, you can make a form that's something like what Rails gives you, where it knows the users, where they're coming from, because it can read the validations and like the null constraints and the server side types. This is the other thing you will really love about this. If you make a demo app with React server components, the types are just, you're only ever in the server. So you have TypeScript set up. You have something like a Prisma or Drizzle or whatever that's returning a type data structure in TypeScript. And then you render your UI, and the types are just, you're only in the server. That's fine.
I love types.
And then you pass the props, and then the types pass through props, just like they pass through props in React components. So that is an amazing, like magical moment for sure. But I think it will be really interesting to see, form libraries that are server components, or use a mix of server and client components, but the server components can like dynamically read the schema and the types of your data and show you validation errors, again, without you having to set all that stuff up because of that cohesion. So I'll be really interested to see the kind of abstractions that come out in React in the next 5 to 10 years, because server components are pretty thought-provoking and fascinating.
I need to do some more research, but thank you for coming on and doing a little bit of an ELI 5. I appreciate it.
No problem, man.
For everyone that's listening, by the way, for everyone that's listening, if you're listening on Frontend First, you might like Backend Banter. It's another podcast. If you're listening to Backend Banter, you might like Frontend First. Go check it out. Sam, is there anything else that you want to plug? Your Twitter, your YouTube, anything like that, for everybody to go check out?
Yeah, Twitter's probably a good place to keep up with me. I have a YouTube channel. I haven't made a video in a bit because I had like 3 conference talks this year, so I was just taking a little break. But I'd like to get back into that soon. So feel free to hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions. And that's it, man. Thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun, dude.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. We'll talk to you later.
All right, bye.